You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 56. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, but if you want to support it and the kinds of things we like to do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET 5. We're back on the air after a little delay, but we've got some great news. Starting this February, we're going to be doing a road trip to cover 25 cities across North America and Europe. We'll be doing live interviews with some of your favorite developers, including Scott Guthrie, Tim Huckabee, Juliac, and more. See hwroadtrip.com for more information on cities and dates for this free community event. On today's show, we have the illustrious Peter Ritchie with us. Currently a software architect at Quicken Loans, Peter Ritchie has over 12 years' experience working with .NET and C#. Prior to focusing on C#, Peter worked primarily in C and C++, which accounts for the majority of his 26 years of programming and design experience. Peter works with a variety of applications and systems, including WinForms, WPF applications, client-server applications, distributed applications, and web applications. Components include Windows services, TCP servers, TCP clients, HTTP server, and HTTP clients. Peter has also worked with a variety of middleware, including RabbitMQ and MSMQ. Peter has spoken internationally on a variety of topics, including unit test design and management, asynchronous programming, advanced .NET language features and syntax, concurrent and parallel programming, and distributed programming. Peter is the author of Refactoring with Visual Studio 2010 and Visual Studio 2010 Best Practices. I've known Peter primarily from the conference set, and Peter's recently made the jump from living in Canada to living in Arizona, and that is one big change in both weather and environment. And today I talked to Peter about how he got started and his early work in C and C++, especially in flight simulator programs. I think you're going to enjoy this one. On today's show, I'd like to welcome Peter Ritchie to the show. How are you doing, Peter?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Sean?
I'm good. And so Arizona from the Great White North, what's that transition been like?
Well, that's been great. It's quite a different temperature change, but I never really liked the cold, so moving to Arizona seemed like a really good opportunity for me just to get away from the snow, let alone, just finding a nice place to live.
And certainly Phoenix doesn't have its any snow. Can you still get to snow up in the mountains, or really it's over for you?
We could if we wanted to. There's a town kind of north of Phoenix called Sedona that's probably the closest town that's kind of higher than us. So if we really wanted to see snow, we could spend a couple hours driving up there and seeing snow. There's also northern Arizona, so we could see snow if you want, or there's the mountains over near California that we could see snow if we wanted to, but I have no plans to do that.
So you spent a long time in Canada, which means you're over snow.
Oh yeah, I was over snow years ago. I was born there. I think I spent all but 6 years there.
Oh, wow.
For kind of most of high school, I was in St. Louis. They have snow too, but it's a little bit south from Ontario, so it's a lot less snow than we would get in Ottawa.
Wow. And so have you survived a summer in Phoenix yet to make sure you've made the right decision?
Yeah, it was funny because when we got here, it was it's about 6 months ago, so March, April, and people would say, oh, it's a nice temperature now, but wait till you experience a summer, and they would, talk about how it was sort of a horribly high temperature and things, but we made it through August and July, and we found it great. I think we had a high of about 115 a few days, or maybe a week or two, but first thing we did, of course, was go outside and, experience it and feel the nice warmth and stuff like that, and people would be looking out the windows at us like, oh my God, they're outside. What are they doing? So we've been enjoying it. It's great.
Wow. 115, I just can't imagine. Though they tell me it's a dry heat, so it might not be the same.
Yeah, it sounds like a cliche, but it's completely different. So I think during the summer, it might be about 20% humidity. So I would keep our air conditioning probably about 80, and that would be cool enough for us. Whereas, when we were in summer in Canada, probably I think we'd hit about 25, which I think was about 80 to 90.
Right.
So we'd kind of keep it much lower than 80 inside because the humidity would make it a little bit more unbearable. So I think if I had to live in a place like Mississippi or something, I think I'd probably keep my air conditioning closer to 70 than 80 just to keep the humidity at bay.
That's what we do. That's what we do here in Atlanta. Certainly, we have our share of humidity. So on the show, we'd like to kind of delve how you got started. Did you have a computer as a kid, or how did that work?
Yeah, I think, and I don't remember which computer I started with. I started with in school, we had Apple IIe's that we were working with, but at home I had an Atari 800 that I worked with. I just don't remember which one I started with. I think it was the Atari, but it's been, 2 or 3 decades, if not more, that I'm willing to admit anyway, since I used it. So it gets a little hazy after about 2 or 3 decades. So
that's what I'm told. So, and you had the Atari 800 at home?
Yeah, so I had the 800 at home that I'd play with. It was kind of supposed to be the family computer, I guess, but I guess I was kind of the only person interested in it. I mean, it would do things like word processing. We had a printer, a dot matrix printer that was, louder than most jet engines and things like that. But nobody seemed interested in doing any of that sort of thing. So I basically just kept it in my room and kind of played around with it in my spare time.
Oh, that's cool. The only thing I miss about dot matrix printers is being able to print out those really long banners on the continuous paper.
Yeah. Well, yeah, kind of back then I created a couple what we'd call now user groups. And I would do that. I would, print out this banner and say, here's where we are and blah, 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 the name of the user group and et cetera, et cetera. There's actually a point in time where I found something, back then it wasn't the web, but on BBSs I found something like a kind of a hack where you could put this sensor on your printer and you take the ribbon out and you basically tell it to print things and it would scan pieces of paper as it went through the printer, and we'd actually scan things using the printer that way. It was kind of cool. It was
wow.
Very I think we might have gotten maybe 100 DPI on the scan, but I mean that was my experience with my first scanner. Was one that I actually created myself.
Wow, that's crazy. And 100 DPI, in those days was about as high as you could print. So it's about the same. Wow. Yeah,
we would think wow, and on your screen, which I don't remember what the resolution of the screen was, but I think when screen resolutions hit 800 wide, I thought, wow, we'd never need anything wider than that. But so these things were scanning images that were, more than we'd ever think we'd need on a computer. So it's great.
Well, you had 64K. How much, you should be fine.
Well, on that computer, I think I started out with 8. No, it was 16. The 800 had 16 and the 400 had 8. So at some point I decided that 16 wasn't enough. So I took apart my Atari, ripped out all the RAM chips and plugged in bigger RAM chips. That took me a while to get that working because, that was my first foray into soldering. So there's a couple spots I missed. So I had to go in and that's about the point where I decided I need to buy a voltmeter so I'd actually check the continuity of all my connections. So once I figured that out and got all my connections running, I got my computer working again.
I remember when you would buy a memory upgrade, I don't know if it was the same for the Atari, but you would get this chip-shaped tube of chips. And so you'd go in and come back with like a 2-foot-long tube of chips, and everyone made you too afraid of the sort of static that you were going to destroy the chips. Of course, you'd never know when you shorted the chip. And my favorite part, or I guess my least favorite part, was if you bent the chip the pin twice, it just broke off.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that was a design feature or not, but and you could only buy them in those banks. So once you screwed up one little arm, either you're doing hand soldering or buying a whole new set.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I did. About this tube of chips that you would get. So I forget what it was. I had a bank of 8 or 16 chips. So and your memory depended on all the chips. So if one wasn't there, you had no memory. It just wouldn't work. So if you broke one chip pin or something like that, you'd have to get a replacement chip, and nobody sells them by the chip. They just sell them by the tube. So you'd have to go buy a whole new tube of chips.
That's just crazy. Just crazy. I remember being envious of the Atari, even 400 and 800 users I knew, because my VIC-20 only had 5K, and you guys, languishing in your 8 and 16K.
Yeah, I remember back in the day when somebody said 16K ought to be enough for everybody, but that wasn't enough for me, so I ramped it up.
That's funny. And were you writing, little pieces of software on the Atari?
Yeah, I think I started with Atari BASIC, which, I never really thought about the history of it or not, but I'm sure it was basically just like MS BASIC in an Atari form. Had all the same instructions as far as I can remember.
Sure.
So I kind of started with that, and then I quickly realized that once you spend a couple hours writing a program in BASIC, when you got nowhere to save it, because back then there was no disk drives on some of these computers, so with nowhere to save it, it was like, well, that was fun, but now what do? I don't want to turn my computer off now. I lose all this work. So I quickly went out and bought a tape drive, because at the time that was kind of the only thing that was available that was, kind of under $2,000 or something like that. So I got that and saved a few programs to tape drive and whatnot. And every once in a while I'd be able to load them in my first try, but usually it took a couple tries to load them back in again and run them. And that's kind of the fun I had with Atari BASIC.
I love the idea of the tape drives, because there are listeners to the show who have never used a cassette tape for music. And then just the idea that those same cassette, those same cassettes were used to save actual data. And I remember jamming one in my tape drive in the Commodore and having to put the pencil in to screw it back in, hoping I didn't stretch the tape, and for what I would have done for a solid state drive back then.
Yeah, exactly. Or even being able to do a backup.
Yeah.
I suppose I could have done a tape-to-tape backup. I don't know if that would ever work with data. I don't see why not. It's just sound, but I never did that, but that would have been a great idea. Then if I lost my tape, or the tape got stretched, or occasionally it would break, then I wouldn't lose all my work.
That's funny. And you could have just printed it out, then you could have retyped it next time. That would have been fine.
Yeah, and some of the things I used to kind of work with or play around with were code from magazines. So you'd get the magazine, and it would get, explain everything that was going on with the code, and then you'd get the listing, and you could type it all in, and then run it, and of course something wouldn't work. So eventually they came up with the idea of having checksums. So they'd give you this special editor, and you type it all in, and it would give you a checksum at the end of each line to make sure you typed in each line perfectly. So that was like, back in the day, that was the quantum leap in computing, was having a checksum. So when you retyped in somebody else's code, because they weren't going to give you a disk with anything on it, because a disk was probably $20 a pop back then.
Yeah.
So then you could type it in and everything would be good, and that was kind of the thing at the time.
In Commodore BASIC, the whole typing of apps was a big deal, like it was, I'm sure, on Atari. But because so much was done in a lot of the programs in just either storing data or actually writing a little machine code with these lines of pokes and arrays and things like that, if there was a bug in the magazine, it was so far beyond what I could figure out how to debug, because it was normally one of these big sections of just numbers that were wrong. Mm-hmm. And so you'd wait until the next issue when they would go, oh, by the way, line 408 is wrong, and this is what it should be.
Yeah. And
really?
Like, wow, now I can get it to run again. This is great. Although I don't know how they ever had stuff like that, because, you basically take the program and print it into the magazine. I don't know.
You would think.
If it worked, then you'd think they wouldn't have printed it, but...
Yeah, it's just crazy. So, and did you start using computers at school near the same time?
Yeah, I think it was around the same time. So I want to say around 82, but That's a while ago, so I can't really remember specific years at this point. So, but certainly in the early 80s.
And were these classes, or was this like the computer club at school, or?
I don't think my school actually had a computer club, so it must have just been a class. So I think it was a programming class. Back then, I don't think they really considered anything programming, so I don't remember if that's what they called the class. It might have been,
probably just the computer class
or something like that. Yeah. So part of it was that we'd do some programming in Apple BASIC. So I would, having done stuff in Atari BASIC already, so at least I think this is the case. It's been a while since I did it, so maybe I just had an aptitude with the Apple, then I got the Atari, but I think it was the other way around. I think I had the Atari first, worked with Atari BASIC, and then started playing around with the Apple II in class. So I'd blow through my assignments pretty fast, and whatever I was doing, the instructor was happy with, so I would wander around after that, helping other people with their stuff, because, back then, nobody sort of had computers. It's not like you had a phone that you worked with, or you had an Xbox that you played around with. That people were used to computers. These were brand new to everybody, so I had no aptitude at all for them. So I'd go around helping people for whatever reason. I had an aptitude for it, so I would get people to manage to get through their assignments and not go insane trying to figure out what they were trying to do.
That's awesome. You seem to, having started the, what we now call a user group, you seem to enjoy that sort of interaction with other computer people.
Yeah, and for some reason, there's kind of there's all sorts of people that work with computers, but some don't really want to leave their house, sort of thing. So there's kind of a class of people you kind of interact with, at least back then, with what we might call user groups now. So you kind of get the really extroverted people who want to sit and talk all the time, compared to probably, back then it was probably the majority of people who were introverts and they didn't really want to come out to user group meetings, things like that. But sure. Back then, I was kind of doing BBSs and things. I had my own BBS and going to other BBSs and things. So I kind of interacted with a lot of people online back even in the early 80s, which is probably, not a very common thing. So I'd meet a lot of people online, and then we'd kind of get together in real life and talk about things, or we'd all just sit in front of a computer and type. But, that's kind of what we did back then.
Or trade software?
Yeah.
I remember those.
I don't remember if we traded tapes or not. This is a long time before DVDs or CDs, so we'd either have floppy disks, like the 5 1/4-inch floppy disks, or tape drives. Yeah,
I remember the one friend who had 2 drives. He would come to the party so that you could make copies of the 5 1/4s that he had, and he became the big shot because he had the second drive.
Yeah.
And so you went to. Decided to go to college for computers? How did that happen?
Yeah, I guess kind of end of high school, because I had to come back to Canada. I used to live in St. Louis, and I graduated high school in St. Louis, and then about that same year, we decided to go back to Canada. So when I came back in Canada at the time, they had grade 13. They've since gotten rid of it, but so I had to do another year of school, and at that point I kind of had to make a decision. Okay, when I'm done grade 13, what am I going to do with my life? Do I get a job doing something? And at that point I hadn't really done a lot in the way of work, maybe mowing lawns and stuff like that, and that was about it. But moving forward past high school and at college, you'd think, okay, well, maybe I need to think about a career. So I spent a while trying to figure out what I might want to do, because at that point I still hadn't really taken programming and working with computers seriously enough to consider it a career. And there wasn't really at the time a lot of career options for that type of thing. It's not like everybody and their dog was using computers or anything, so people needed to write programs for all these things. So the opportunities weren't there at the time, so I hadn't really thought about it as a career. So, but after a while thinking, it's like, well, there's this thing at college I could do, and I could basically do what I'm doing at home in my spare time for fun, and I could do it at college for 8 hours a day for a few years, and then come out at the end of it with a piece of paper that theoretically people would say, yeah, we want to hire you to do that. So I decided, yeah, well, why don't I try that? Worst case is it's a complete bust, and I go back to college for something else.
Interesting. In college, did you, I'm pretty sure they weren't teaching Atari BASIC. What were you learning as far as language and, those sorts of things in college?
That's true. There was no Ataris at college for some strange reason. We kind of, I mean, back then it was polyglot. We would learn basically every programming language there was known to man at the time. So we would do assembly. I actually did a course or two on COBOL. We got into C. And we didn't do C++ because at that time there wasn't a C++ compiler. It was kind of the stuff that Bjarne Stroustrup was talking about at the time, more as a theory than anything else. Or even then, the first iteration of C++ was just a C preprocessor kind of thing. So I didn't get any formal training in C++. So it was mostly C, COBOL, assembly. I don't think we did anything in BASIC, but
and do you still put COBOL on the resume? Because there's a big demand.
Yeah, I probably could have made a lot of money in around 98, 99, but kind of had a few ethics, so I decided not to do that sort of thing. So.
Evidently, NASA is looking for Fortran programmers. So,
oddly enough, I never did any Fortran.
Interesting.
I've probably done a lot of different languages, and Fortran wasn't one that I did. I ended up doing Pascal for a while, but that's probably as close to Fortran as I ever got.
Interesting. So you're in college, you're sort of absorbing everything you can. And is it, now that you're in a more structured environment, is this changing the way you're learning about computers and software and all that? Is this, the sort of, excitement, or is this drudgery?
I don't know if I'd call it drudgery. I would always be kind of the guy who was ahead of everybody, because I would already have known something, or as soon as somebody mentioned it, I wanted to know more about it. So I would kind of learn it before the instructor would start talking about it. Then
Sure.
I mean, to a certain extent, it was kind of boring for me because I would already know what they were talking about when they started talking about it, because I would read ahead in the book, because, that's kind of what my passion was all about at the time. So,
yeah.
And it's funny because we'd go through, the exams every now and again, or tests, and I'd be the one to always come up at the end and say, I think, you marked this question wrong. And, about 3/4 away into the semester, when I started to come up to the desk after he passed out the test, he said, okay, what score do you want? Like, was it perfect or not? I don't want to talk to you anymore about this.
You could see the anxiety come on his face.
Yeah, it's okay. I know he's going to be right, so I'll just let me know what the score should be, and I'll write it in my book.
That's funny. And did you work in group projects in college?
Yeah, one of the courses we had, of course, probably more than one, actually. It's probably 3 or 4, I think, were analysis courses. So we'd have to get into groups, and we'd have to analyze requirements and things like that. They didn't call it requirements back then, but that's effectively what they were. And we've come a long way since then in terms of kind of what we do in terms of analysis and design and implementation of those things. But we did get in groups of people. There'd be, a product owner, which isn't what they called it back then, but that's what we call it now, who would kind of understand what they wanted and the requirements around it. And we'd have discussions with them, and there'd be multiple groups of people, and they'd all be able to have the same discussion with the same person, but we'd all come out at the end with a different analysis or a different design, and we'd have to document it all in kind of whatever documentation style they wanted at the time.
And was this your first experience sort of trying to work towards a goal? Was it teaching you that team dynamics is so important in software?
I don't know if it taught me then, but it certainly, reinforced it that, eventually you're going to have to talk to people to find out what they want. It's fun to write your own software and to play around with stuff, but eventually you have to get something that somebody else wants, and it's got to do what they want, not necessarily what you want. So a lot of it was about trying to figure out what they actually wanted and trying to get it down on paper or into code and be the thing that they actually wanted it to be.
Interesting. And how did your college life transition into sort of that first job? Did you work during school?
In that particular series of courses that I was in, they had a co-op option.
Oh, nice.
For whatever reason, I didn't get into the co-op, and I don't remember why. I don't think there was anything that interested me as a job at the time. So Ottawa is a government town, so I think most of the positions were kind of government jobs, and I didn't really want to do that. So I basically just kept going. So instead of going through co-op over the summer, I would simply say, okay, well, let me just do my courses for the next semester, and I'll just continue doing that. So I basically went through college without any sort of break. Got to a point where somebody offered me a job for whatever reason, and then I decided I would just take the job, and I just stopped going to school instead of instead of spending all my time at school, I decided I'd spend all my time at this job. So I basically just transitioned from being in college to being in a job. So.
And so you seem to have a passion for, just trying to absorb material, whether you're at the job or at school. Does that drive you, just as long as you're sort of the continuous learning idea?
Yeah. And I've gone to school. People are like, during school, they're like, oh, I can't wait to be out of school so I can stop learning things. But I think we're constantly learning. Like, every couple of years or so, we seem to get some new different video, playback format. So we have to relearn all that stuff all over again. So learning is something we have to do constantly. So every time I see something new that I've never heard about, I go and research it. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't have to be computer related, but, somebody will say a word that I've never heard about. So that's a new word. So I'll go look at that, and I'll find the etymology of the word and figure out where it came from and all that stuff. So I think I've gotten to the point where my head is full of useless information that I need to start getting rid of somehow, but I'm not sure how to do that.
I think that comes naturally with age. At least it's been my experience.
Well, yeah, I made a point of saying useless information. That seems to stay in my head, and all the useful information, like all the phone numbers I've ever had, seem to disappear.
Luckily, that's not as important to us. Someone asked me my wife's phone number the other day, and I had to really think about it, because I haven't, I don't think I've actually dialed it ever. She texted me, I added it to my phone book, and then I press her face to call her. And then when I needed to tell it to somebody, I'm like, I feel like I should know it.
Exactly. Yeah. Fortunately for me, when we moved to Arizona, we both got a new phone at the same time, and we had to get a phone number because the area code was Canadian that we used to have. So fortunately, our phone numbers are almost identical. There's just one digit that's different. So I can
that helps.
Manage to remember that. I can't remember her old phone number, but I can remember her new one.
Well, that's it's the little things.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
The little things. So at this new job, what were you doing?
So it kind of got into a company that was doing games. And their claim to fame at the time was they had done a lot of puzzle games, and I think they had realized fairly quickly that there wasn't any money in the puzzle games because nobody wanted to spend any money on it. So they kind of transitioned into specializing in a flight simulation software. So a lot of the games that I work with were flight simulation games. And when I got hired on, they were still doing Atari games at the time. So that was kind of where I fit into the organization. I was the Atari guy, so I would do all these Atari games in whatever Atari language was at the time. I think it was C, but I can't remember it specifically.
And when there was
certainly some assembly that we had to do both on the Atari and in the PC games.
Nice. And when you say Atari, are you talking like the console, or are you talking about 400s and 800s or STs?
Back then it would have been the STs.
Oh, okay. Okay,
so
that
they
makes
were
sense.
Still selling ST games, and that Atari transitioned that to TT, which was their 32-bit version. They were really creative with their names, so they got 16-bit, 32-bit, TT, and things like that. But I don't think we ever did anything in the TT, because that seemed to just sort of... I mean, it was a nice computer, and I had one for a long time, but nobody ever did anything with it.
I don't even remember the TTs. ST is the last Atari I remember, and I think I got a PC soon after, sort of the ST and the Amiga phase of them, and then PCs seemed to take over the world right after that.
Yeah, I think around the same time, I think Atari kind of started to collapse too, so I don't think that really helped the actual line of computers. But yeah, around that time, I think the PCs became kind of more of a business computer or whatnot, because I think those started out as, hobby computers where you have this box with a bunch of slots in it that you could play around with and stick things in and whatnot. So I think those kind of took on the form factor of what companies like Commodore and Atari were doing, and kind of a smaller computer instead of this box that was, larger than most people's printers at the time.
Yeah.
And that made it a little bit more acceptable to the general population. So I think that's kind of where things took off from there. And there was a lot of people doing work on PC at the time, so I think a lot of people were easily transitioned into software for the PC, so that just exploded and people had something to use it for, and that's kind of what drove it. Whereas kind of the Ataris and the Commodores were interesting computers, but they didn't really have anything that people wanted to use outside of games and things like that. So
yeah, I think people thought of them as home computers and the idea of running a business off of them. Though I'm sure there's some businesses running out there on Commodore 64s and Atari 800s. Evidently, the French airport got shut down because of a Windows 3.1 crash yesterday.
Yeah. So if that's the case, then there's got to be somebody out there with an Atari or at least a Commodore or even an Amiga. I mean, those are decent computers too. So
yeah, you would think. So in this flight simulator stuff you were working with C and C++?
We started out with C and assembly. So around the time I started there wasn't a commercial C++ compiler yet, so we were still kind of stuck in C and assembly. So I would do things in 6502 assembly or 68000 assembly, as well as doing things for the PC and Intel assembly. And back then, I think we still concentrated just on x86.
Sure.
We hadn't really gotten into the 286 era yet, so we were still just doing x86, kind of bland x86 assembly programming.
Interesting. And did you have a passion for language, or was language more of a tool?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, I would always kind of learn new languages and, try to figure out what I could use for it. So I got really good at batch languages there for a while, and probably could still do a lot with batch languages, but it was really just kind of the language that I needed to work in. So if we had to do something for a flight simulator that nobody's done before, and it needed to be fast, of course, then we would do it in assembly because that's the fastest we could go with it. So we were doing, matrix math and assembly and things like that because there wasn't a library available to do these sort of things. We'd have to invent these things and be able to do 3D transforms right in assembly to, change the direction or change the view of our 3D world that's on the screen.
Wow. Was the drop down into assembly about language functionality or primarily about performance?
It was almost all about performance.
Yeah.
There was certain things that you could do easier in assembly, and we would have to kind of publish that out into something that a C program could use. So we didn't really spend a lot of time doing things in assembly unless we had to, because the actual program was a C program, and we'd have to call out to some of the assembly routines that we would create. But we would create those simply because we couldn't do it fast enough in C or whatever other languages that we might have been using at the time. And eventually we made our way to C++. But that was even a hard route to go down, because that would actually, just transitioning to C++ would make everything slower because of all the extra work involved with things. Instead of just making a function call, you'd have to look up in a vtable where the method was and then make the function call. So things are a little bit slower, and it took us a while to transition into C++. I think it wasn't until we got the 286 computers going and we were selling just a 286 is when we kind of switched over to C++, just because we needed, and I think at the time we were looking at 15 frames a second, and we couldn't get that in C++ on the x86. So that's kind of why we kind of had to drop down to assembly and stuck around in assembly and C for a long time.
Interesting. And so the whole notion of letting the hardware catch up to you really impacted your early career.
Yeah, it's funny because we would do things, and back then, and when I started there, I couldn't find anything that kind of described the way we would do our programming or the way we would design these applications. And it was a world, and we'd have things in it with 3D coordinates, and there'd be a timer that would bounce like this. And it's basically the same way you do a game now, where you've got this timer that periodically hits, and you would do your calculations and you'd update the world in whatever way you needed to update it, and then that would get rendered onto the screen based on that particular time frame. And we'd be able to do that probably 10 to 15 times a second, depending on kind of what was going on. If there's a lot of things in the world, then that would slow down. If there's less things, that would speed up, sort of thing. So
interesting. And that's still the way it works. There's a video out right now of Fallout 4 that if there's a lot going on in the world, that the character actually swings their holding slower than when, they're just looking at a blank wall. You would think after all this time they would get that right.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of the algorithms that are used for games have been around for decades, and one of the problems that we had to overcome in a lot of our flight simulator games is it's the way the world or the horizon is calculated, and the way the algorithm would work is if the horizon spanned the top corner on the right to the top corner on the bottom, or vice versa, the algorithm would fail because it wasn't designed to do that sort of thing. So as you would rotate your plane in the flight simulator, we would make sure we never hit that case. So if we kind of tilted it to 45 degrees, we'd say, oh, no, you're really at 46 or 44, just so we wouldn't run into that situation where the algorithm would fail. And we were doing stuff like this in the 80s. And I remember looking at a game, I must have been the late 90s or early 2000s, where I would do that. I'd go into a flight simulator and I know where there's some issues. Let me try that. And sure enough, I would get it to 45 degrees and it would just blank out. So you'd have to basically come out of 45 degrees and then your screen would come back. But yeah, a lot of the issues that are around have been around for a long time, and nobody seems to feel the need to fix them.
Interesting. How long did you stay at the game company?
I think I was there for 4 years.
And did you find other developers that sort of mentored you since you're fresh out of college, or was everyone pretty much on the same, level, or just, it's so new that everyone's, cowboying up, as it were?
Well, there was a lot of stuff we had to invent at the time. I mean, there was some basic algorithms and books for graphics and things like that we used, but we'd have to write it all. We'd have to figure out the math around it and write it in code ourselves. So when I started, they had games for a long time before I started. So they had guys there that knew what they were doing and they knew all about this stuff. And I would look at these guys as mentors and say, okay, teach me about all this stuff. I want to do this, and we already had all the code, but I would like to understand it in case I need to do something with it and stuff. So at that point, yeah, I had a couple of good guys there that were mentoring me for various things, and I had a great time learning stuff there.
And did that inform the way you work with other people today? I mean, was that first job as informative to your career as it is for a lot of people?
I never really thought about it, but I guess it has. I mean, I would kind of look at the way they would interact with me as somebody who I would look up to as somebody more knowledgeable than me. And I would say that kind of drove the way I would interact with people who I was trying to teach, or I may know more about than them, and I'd be able to communicate to them what they should do or how they need to know things and things like that.
Interesting. And was that a space, the sort of graphics and math space that you stayed in most of your career, or did that change?
That's funny. As soon as I left there, I just completely changed gears and went on to something else. After that, I went to a company called Cognos, and their claim to fame was multidimensional reporting and analysis. And
could not have been any more different.
Completely the opposite of what I was working on. Nowadays, we call that BI. But I started there, and that was kind of the beginning of my Windows experience. So I had to do business-oriented apps. So I want to say we were working in Windows 3.1 at the time, but that was a while ago. But and that's how I kind of switched gears and started getting into kind of UI programming and, database and doing analysis with numbers and things like that.
The space that so many developers are in these days.
Yeah.
I remember trying to work for a gaming company a number of years ago, and then when I realized that because so many developers like the idea of working on games, that they sort of mistreated developers because they knew there were 4 guys trying to get in. This was in the mid-90s after games had sort of exploded. Did you have any of that experience back in the flight simulator, or was it just a normal working environment?
I think going into it, I didn't really see that type of thing, but that's kind of why I got out of it, was kind of that sort of thing. Like, we would have games and we would get bonuses based on the sales of those games, but personally I never saw a bonus based on sales. Wow. And I knew EA was selling lots of these games, like probably thousands, tens of thousands of these games at the time, and we never saw anything like that. But that was always kind of the assumption going into a new game is, we're going to sell this game and you're going to make some profit on it once it sells and things like that. So it's kind of like the writing book thing that currently, if you had it compared to something more contemporary, it would be that like that, where you can write a book and we'll give you some upfront money, and then we'll pay you based on the sales of the book. Which nowadays nobody actually buys any books, so there's bonuses to get out of it. It's just kind of one of those things you kind of give to the world for free kind of thing.
At least it feels that way sometimes.
Yeah. So we kind of had I don't know what the average salary was back then. I don't think we were making a whole lot of money. Sure. So we probably could have got paid more instead of having a promise of bonuses, but that's just kind of the way it worked. So
Absolutely. So looking back, at any part of your career, is there anything you would change?
I don't think I'd change anything. I probably wouldn't have gotten into those situations where, businesses or people would take advantage of me. I would go into things, and I kind of learned early on that people were going to try to make money off of my skills and things like that. So I never, going into the .com bubble, I never really accepted any jobs that were, kind of equity based. I never accepted those. I had a lot of people come to me and say, "Oh, we're going to give you 1 million shares if you work for us, and that's all we're going to pay with." And I always say no. And that's about the time I think I got into running my own company and consulting to various other companies. And I would just simply say, no, my rate is this. If you're not going to pay the rate, then I'm not going to do the work, because I got other people who would like to pay me that rate and do the work. So
absolutely. And how long did you do consulting? Because now you work for Quicken Loans, right?
Yeah, about 6 months I took the job at Quicken Loans as a software architect, and before that, I think it was 97 to 2015.
Wow, that's quite a run.
Yeah, quite a few years, and I enjoyed it. One of my problems that I had early on was that I would get frustrated with projects. People would, and this is kind of a symptom of the lack of any sort of way of integrate or dealing with people and trying to get their requirements and figuring things out. Back then, it was all basically you just made it up as you went along. People would ask you to do something, and you would do it, and then they say, "Well, that's not really what I wanted," and then you go through this process of fixing things, and that, of course, led down, and is basically waterfall, and that would lead you down to this situation where you've got all this software that's been changed so many times, and it's so buggy that you can't use it, and then you go into a rewrite cycle and do it all over again. So I kind of got frustrated with working like that. So I got into, working with contracts at 6 months at a time. So by the time we got to the point where the software was in a state where it had to be rewritten, I could either choose to continue on or just not accept a new contract and move on to something new. So that's kind of the avenue I went down. And then I could work on, new projects every 6 months or every year or every 2 or whatever was going on in that particular time frame. And I could work on a bunch of different things and kind of fuel my creativity and do the things I wanted to do, or do new things even, and just learn and learn and learn.
And for me, the consulting seemed to be a little bit about my short attention span, and that even if a project was going well, sometimes I just needed to learn something new. Creating, we have 400 more screens that look approachably like the last 300 you did. We're just going to fire the way through there. At some point, I would get just board blind is the way I like to think about it, where I just can't, I just have to go play with something new. And contracting really enabled me to do that, so that it didn't look like I quit every job after 2 years.
Yeah. And the contract had a specific start and a specific end, so it's not like you were quitting or anything.
Right.
That's time to move on to another contract. Most of the time with any of my contracts, they weren't prepared enough to get me renewed by the renewal date anyway. So, like probably within a month of the end of my contract, I'd be looking for other contracts just, because, if they're not giving me something new, then I got to find, this is my business. I have to fend for my business, so I have to go and do these things.
Absolutely.
So I would do it, and I would, go to them, at some point where somebody would offer me a new contract, and I would go to them and say, "Look, I got these guys who want to give me a contract, and I got to know by the end of the week, do you want me to, stay on or not?" And they almost, at least 75% of the time, they just weren't prepared enough to even make a decision on it. So it was just kind of easy to make a decision on my part. So, okay, well, I'm just going to move on then, and you go on to something else.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Well, I want to thank you for being on the show. This has been really good. Learning how flight simulators were built back in the 80s is something that has always fascinated me. Just what was actually required to do a lot of that stuff, and how you learned all this stuff along the way. I appreciate you being on the show.
Thanks. I appreciate being on the show. It was great chatting with you.
Awesome. And we'll see you next time that you can cook food on the street in Phoenix, I assume.
Sounds good. Yeah. Maybe in the summer, I said I was going to do it this summer, but I never got around to it by cooking eggs on the street, but I'm pretty sure it can be done.
Have you considered one of those solar barbecues that I've seen? Where
I don't think you need them here. I think you just need a frying pan and you can put it on the street and you could cook an egg and probably fry some bacon on there. There's actually a story about a guy a few years back who tripped and fell on the road, and he got third-degree burns just because he fell onto the road and couldn't get up fast enough.
Wow. Yeah, that's not... No, you enjoy Phoenix.
That's why I walk down the concrete, because it's a little bit cooler.
It is. Well, you have a good day, and we'll talk soon.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World Podcast. Remember, you can subscribe to the Hello World Podcast